It's Daf Samach Tet, right? 69. And we're starting on Daf Samach Tet on Mabet. We're actually going to start 8 lines from the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The first word on the line is Rabbi Yochanan. He said he did this yesterday, but it's good to repeat it. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Zar ein mitama beit habliya, saken mitama beit habliya. So what are we talking about? Remember, hopefully everyone learned yesterday's daf, or it's going to be a little confusing. But there is a halacha, very important halacha, that when an animal dies, it's called a nevela if it's not shechted. And a nevela is mitameh b'maga u'b'masa. If you touch it or you lift it, it makes you tameh. A bird that dies is not tameh b'maga u'b'masa. A bird that dies is tameh on what's called beit habli'ah, meaning your throat, meaning if you eat it, it becomes tameh. So touching a dead bird does not make you tameh. Eating a dead bird makes you tameh. The Mishnah, yesterday's Mishnah, discussed the fact that when you do malika on a bird, that is usually not the way we shecht the bird, right? In Empire, they use a knife. Malika is using your nail, your finger, as we learned, and that generally would make a bird puzzle. But in the Beit HaMikdash, it's okay, right? And the Mishnah then discussed what about, and therefore you can eat that bird if it's a chata, right? And it's not tameh, even if it's an ola. What about if the shechita, the malika, was done incorrectly? So the Mishnah said, well, it depends. In some cases, if the malika is done incorrectly, although the carbon is puzzle, the animal is not mitame because the malika was enough to make it not died inappropriate. It's like it was shechted. And we gave an example. The Mishnah gave some examples. We're going to have more of them later today. One example was if you used your left hand, right? If the Kohen used his left hand to do malika, then it's puzzle, but it's a kosher enough malika that the animal is not mitameh a beit habliya. It's not tameh because it's as if you did a shechita of the animal. Then we said if you did it at night, it's also kosher. Yesterday, Rav, the Amora from Bavel, introduced an opinion that a zar, if a foreigner did malika of a carbon in the Beit HaMikdash, of a bird, it would be a problem, and it always is a problem. I mean, it's puzzle, but it's mitameh a Beit habliya because we don't compare. This is Rashi's understanding. We don't compare to a bama. A bama, a private altar, which existed before the Beit HaMikdash, anyone could do work on, even a zar, right? And we don't say, oh, if a zar can do it on a bama, then when they do it in the
Even
Beit,
then, I do.
even a non-Jew, thank you, anyone. And therefore, if you might say, oh, well, then in the Beit HaMikdash, if they do it, it's possible, but it's not like left hand, which we said was kosher. It's not mitamei Beit HaBliyah because on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol did the avodah with the left hand. So even though you're not supposed to do it, sometimes you do it. So Rav said, well, we don't compare it to a bama. A bama is a whole different reality. It's not relevant, right? That was yesterday. Says Rabbi Yochanan today, now that's that introduction, says Rabbi Yochanan, Azar, a non-Kohen, ein mitameh Beit HaBliyah. In fact, he disagrees with Rav. And if a non-Kohen does malika on a bird in the Beit HaMikdash, it's pasul, but it's not mitameh because you did a proper malika. And furthermore, where am I? Sakin mitameh Beit HaBliyah. But if you use a knife, right, which is the way you normally slaughter an animal, but since it's a carbon in the Beit HaMikdash, it's supposed to be done with the finger. The knife is a complete no-no, and it's mitameh Beit HaBliyah. So the animal is tameh. So that was the machloket Rav and Rabbi Yochanan whether a zar would be mitameh. Now, says the Gemara, let's try to prove it from our Mishnah. It's not. Now we're quoting our Mishnah, 6 lines, 7 lines from the bottom. Our Mishnah said yesterday, Kol hapsulin, all of the people who are pasul, or all the acts that are pasul, shemolku, that did malika on a carbon, malikatan psula, right? The malika is pasul, and the Mishnah continues, we don't quote the important words, and it's not mitameh beit habliyah. Because even though the malika is pasul, the animal does not become tameh like a regular nevela. So Bishon the Rabbi Yochanan, who says that if a zar does it, it's not tameh, kol a zar. The saying kol everyone is always a principle where you're adding people beyond what you mentioned in the Mishnah. So kol includes a zar. El the Rav, kol mai. Rav holds a zar is mitame. So what is kol adding? Lavlat says Gemara, take out the word lav, it doesn't make any sense. His answer is la small velila. It's to include the cases of the left hand or at night. And in those cases, even though the carbon is pasul, it's not mitameh beit habliya. Says the Gemara, that doesn't make any sense. Small velila behedya katani. The next words in the Mishnah are, if you do it with your left hand, if you do it at night, it's not mitameh. Says the Gemara, that's what the Mishnah is doing. Tani v'hadar mefaresh. We often do that. We say a principle, and then we delineate the rules of the principle. So the Mishnah says all people. And then explains all people means using your left hand or doing it at night, but not specifically including Azar according to Rav. Tashma, okay, let's come and prove it from the end of the Mishnah, 2 lines from the bottom. The end of the Mishnah says, Zehaklal, this is the rule. Kol shahaya psulo b'kodesh, anything that's a psul in the Beit HaMikdash, whatever that means, we'll see in a second. Eino mitameh b'gadim ha'Beit HaBliyah. Anything that's a psul specifically related to kachim, right, is if the Kohen or the person does that, it's not kosher, but it's not mitameh ha'Beit HaBliyah. So now Bishlam Rabbi Yochanan, the kol is a zar, right? It's to include even a zar who does something wrong in Beit HaMikdash, doesn't make it a nevela. El lerav latuyimai. According to Rav, what is the kol there to include? Says the Gemara. Well, it says the Gemara answers for Rav. Well, that's a good question, but there was a flip side to the principle in the Mishnah. Tamech, according to your question. Remember, the Mishnah continued and said, and kol shelo psulo b'kodesh is mitameh Beit HaBliyah. Anywhere where the psul is not in the Beit HaMikdash, it is mitameh. So what is that latuyemai, right? So meaning you asked a question, which is a good question about the word kol, but the Mishnah says the word kol twice. So how do you explain that? Says the Gemara, you're right. Ella, clearly it's going to have to be, there's other cases. Ella reisha latuyeh shchitat kachim bifnim. The reisha, which says everything that you do inside the Beit HaMikdash, that's a psulo b'kodesh, is not mitameh Beit HaBliyah, is referring to a case that was not mentioned in the Mishnah, where you did shchita of a karban, of a bird, bifnim, which is possible because you're supposed to do malika, but doing shchita is enough to take away the tumat nevela. And seifa latuye malikat chulin b'chutz. And the seifa is to include if you do malika on chulin b'chutz, which of course has no meaning whatsoever, right? You took a chicken from your backyard and cut off its head with your finger. So there, the Mishnah is saying that's not a psul b'kodesh because it's nothing to do with the karban. It's not a karban, and you're not in the Beit HaMikdash, and therefore it is tameh like a nevela. So therefore, the Mishnah is not a proof to Rav or to Shmuel. However, says the Gemara now, we have a braita. Tanya kavate de Rabbi Yochanan, but there's a braita that supports Rabbi Yochanan because the braita says explicitly malka zar. If a zar does malika on a karban, or a malka pasul, or a pasul person like a kohen who's got a mum or something, does malika on a karban, or pigo of a notar v'tamei, right? You do malika properly, but you have the wrong machshava, or you leave the meat over, or it becomes tamei. In all those cases, the karban's pasul, but it's not a nevela. Ein mitamin abeit habliyah, and it's not a nevela, and it's not mitamei for a person who swallows it, because you did enough, basically, to take away that tuma. So that would be okay. Okay, so that is, we're going to leave it there. We don't have a psak of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Says Rabbi Yitzchak, I have something very interesting to say. I'm a Rabbi Yitzchak, 6 lines from the top. Says Rabbi Yitzchak, who's an Amora, sorry, Shamati Shtayim. You know, I heard two principles. Achat kmitzat zar. One is if you have a zar who comes into the Beit HaMikdash and he does kmitza. Remember, the kmitza is for the karban mincha. Right, a karban mincha, you put your finger in, you take out a kmitza, you put it in a kli, you put it on the mizbeach. One of the rules I heard has to do with if a zar does that, not a kohen. So I walked in, I'm a zar, I walk into the Beit HaMikdash and I do kmitza. What do you do with that, right? And achat malikat zar. And one is if a zar does malika. Now, the concept that I heard this about, says Rabbi Yitzchak, was a concept that we've had many times before, which is incredibly relevant, which is what happens to things that are put on the Mizbeach that are not supposed to be there, right? So remember, there's a lot of things that we say are puzzle, don't put them on the Mizbeach. But what happens post-fact, right? If you do put it on the Mizbeach, do you have to take it down or not take it down? And so we saw already before, and we're going to keep seeing, that there are different categories. Some things, they're so bad you have to take them off the Mizbeach. And some things, once they're on the Mizbeach, they can stay, right? And so we are comparing that very much to this concept of whether Malika is enough to take off the status of nevela from a bird, right? Because there are plenty of things you can do to a bird that are not kosher, like if you do malika in your left hand, but it's enough to make it not a nevela, right? So we're paralleling that to things being put on the mizbeach that are not kosher, but are not so bad, right? And so said Rabbi Yitzchak, I heard that if, let's say you have two examples where a zar does an avoda that they're not supposed to do. One with a mincha, where they take the kmitza, one with a bird, where they do malika. And now you have this kmitza on the mizbeach, on the mizbeach, you have the bird on the mizbeach. I heard about one of these cases, achat tered v'achat shelo tered. One of them, you have to actually go off the mizbeach and throw it away. And one, you leave it and you burn it on the mizbeach. Vavelo yadana. I don't know which one is which. So this is a great, puzzle. What's the difference? They're both pasul with the zar. They both were done incorrectly. They're both on the mizbeach. For some reason, one of them can stay and one can't stay, and I don't know which one. Says Chizkiah to Rabbi Yitzchak, I can solve the puzzle. Mistabra, it makes sense to me that Kemitza tered. That if you did Kemitza, if a Zar did Kemitza of a Mincha, you have to take that off the Mizbeach. Melika lo tered. The Malika, you don't have to take off the Mizbeach. Now, why? What's this Mistabra? So says the Gemara, well, what's the difference? Maishna Malika, why would you say that Malika can stay up on the Mizbeach? What was Rabbi Yochanan's reason? Rashi understands this. The Yeshna bibama. Right? Because since since a Zar is allowed to do avodah on a bama, so although a Zar is not allowed to do avodah in the Beit HaMikdash, since it's mutar in one place, that's enough for the Mizbeach to make it holy. But then Kmitza Nami, Yeshna b'bama. But then you say the same thing about Kmitza. You just like you can put a bird on a bama, you can put a mincha on a bama, and it could be anyone, even a non-Jew, as Charlie said. So therefore, Kmitza should stay on the Mizbeach. You're going to say a mincha b'bama. Maybe you're going to be of the opinion, which is a machloket, that they never brought a carbon mincha on the bama. Remember, the Torah only describes bringing animals on the bama, right? But says the Gemara, that might be true, and it is a machloket. But if you hold that there's no mincha on a bama, there's also no foot nami b'bama. There can't be any birds brought on a bama, because if you're relying on the pasuk that talks about large animals, you have to exclude birds and flour. Right? The Amar of Sheshet, as Rav Sheshet said very explicitly, the divrei ha'omer yesh mincha b'bama, according to the Tana, actually, or the opinion, that you can bring a mincha on a bama, you can also yesh ofot b'bama, then you can bring ofot b'bama. The divrei ha'omer ein mincha, ein ofot, meaning they're inextricably linked. My taima, because the pasuk says they brought zvachim, right? It says, I'm quoting the pasuk now from later on in Shmot, vayishlach et na'arei b'nei Yisrael v'yalu olot, so if you interpret Zevachim literally, it means Zvachim v'lo menachot, Zvachim v'lo afot. And if you don't interpret it literally, then it means Zvachim including menachot and including ofot. So the bottom line is, why would there be a difference? Right? What's your answer, Chizkiah? That it makes sense to me that the bird stays on the Mizbeach, but the mincha comes off the Mizbeach. Why don't you say whatever happens to one should happen to the other? Ela'ema, you know how you would have to explain it according to Chizkiah? The reason that a mincha has to come off the Mizbeach is because a mincha is not as kodesh as this is one way to read it, as kodesh as a malika, meaning, ein kiddush b'kli sharei b'mincha b'bama. The difference is that when you did a mincha on a bama, you would just bring the mincha and put it on the Mizbeach. You wouldn't put it into its own vessel. And so therefore, you're allowed to do a mincha on a bama, but it's a very unique kind of mincha that doesn't get put into a kli sharet. When you go to the Beit HaMikdash and you do a mincha, you never put a mincha straight on the Mizbeach. You put the kmitza into a kli sharet, and then you put it on the Mizbeach. So what you see from there is that the mincha that's done on the Mizbeach is different than the mincha done on a bama. However, malika, it's the same process. In a bama, you would cut off the head and sprinkle it on the Mizbeach, and the Beit HaMikdash, you would do the same thing. And therefore, there's more parallels between malika on a bama and malika in the Beit HaMikdash, such that even if a zar did it, although it's pasul, if you put it on the Mizbeach, you don't have to take it off. But with the mincha, you have to take it off. So that is Chizkiah's answer. If you have another answer, feel free to share it, but the Gemara stops with Chizkiah. So that is how he reconciled this complicated case. Okay, now we're up to the two dots on Daf Samach Tet Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah, Malak bismo, o malayla. In both of those cases, we said in the Mishnah, although it's pasul, it's not mitamea beit habliyah because the malika is enough to take it out of the question of nevela. Says the Gemara Tanu Rabbanan. Let's learn about this in a braita which sort of elaborates on this issue. What does the braita say? It says, says the braita, Yachol tehei malika shehi lifnim. You might have thought that when you have malika, right, malika that is done inside the Beit HaMikdash, which is done for a carbon, right? You might have thought that if you did malika inside, but you did something wrong, right? Meaning you did it possible, you did it at night, you did it with your left hand, you did it in a kohen who's not kosher. You might have thought that is mitama bigadim bebeit habliyah, that since the malika was pasul, the animal is a nevela, and it's mitame. Therefore, the pasuk said, Tamalomer nevela, Therefore, the pasuk said only a nevela is tameh. This is what kind of answer is that? Hanami nevelahi. What do you mean? The bird that you killed improperly, right? Because you're a Kohen with your left hand or you're a whatever, is a nevela. So so maybe it is tameh. Ella, no, no. This is what the Braita means to say. Ella, what the Braita says is Talmud Lomar treifa. Right? The pasuk says, I'm gonna read the whole pasuk now because I have a fancy new Gemara. That's all the psukim. It says v'chol nefesh. I'm reading from Vayikra Yud Zayin. It says v'chol nefesh asher tochal nivela utreifa. Right? Then you should chibes begadav rachatz mayim v'tamei ha'arif. Anyone who eats a nevela and a treifa, he is tamei. Now, says the Braita, we are up to the Braita after the two dots, right? So around 15 lines down. Says the Braita, therefore, it says the word treifa. And the point of saying the word treifa is to tell you that ma treifa she'ein materet et ha'isur, right? A treifa is generally something that basically will never become mutar, right? And in the sense that just like a treifa is something that well, not that it never becomes mutar. It doesn't make a bird a oaf that is treifa. By shechting it, you cannot take away the status of treifa, meaning it remains a treifa. Af kol she'ein materet isur. So too, it has to be when the pasuk is saying that when an animal dies, it becomes a nevela and therefore it becomes tamei abeit habli'ah. It's referring to only something where the act of the animal dying does never makes it mutar. What it's excluding is yatzta malika, and this is the source to exclude malika shehi lifnim, right? To exclude malika that is done inside the Beit HaMikdash, which hoel v'hi materet et ha'isur, since the malika that is done on the inside is sometimes able to make something mutar, because malika of a karban is the right thing to do. So too, in that case, if you kill the animal in such a way, ein mitameh begadim bebeit habliya. It does not be mitameh the begadim bebeit habliya. So basically, this is the source. The fact that the pasuk said that a bird that dies as a nevela or a treifa is mitameh. Why does it say nevela or treifa? Because it's really only referring to nevela, right? And we're going to discuss this a little bit more. But any animal that dies, whether it's a treifa or not, if it's a nevela, it becomes tameh. The reason we said that is that it's referring to only if it died in such a way that never makes the animal permitted. But since malika of a karban, if it was done properly with the right hand and during the day, would make the karban permitted, even when you do it inappropriately, such as at night, it's not mitameh begadim bebeit habliya. So that is the source from the Braita. Okay, continue. That only, of course, explains doing malika b'fnim. Says the Braita, and it's a continuation. Hevi molek, and we would include, right? And sorry, on the side, mine changes to avi, the verb of that. I will include someone who is molek kadshim b'chutz, someone who does malika of a karban outside the Beit HaMikdash. You take a karban, instead of bringing it to the Beit HaMikdash, you kill it with malika outside the Beit HaMikdash. So that, of course, doesn't do anything to the karban. And furthermore, a case where you're molek chulin, you take an animal that's not a karban, a regular chicken, and you do malika on that karban, bein mi b'fnim, bein mi b'chutz, whether you're inside the Beit HaMikdash, where it's not a karban anyways, or you're outside at your home. In those cases, ho ve'ein matirin et ha'isur, since the malika of a kosher, of a regular animal is never appropriate, and malika of a karban outside the Beit HaMikdash is not going to help it. In those cases, it's mitamim begadin beit habliya. So in those cases, if you do malika of a kosher animal, of a kosher, meaning a chulin, a non-hektish animal, not karban, or you do malika of a karban outside the Beit HaMikdash, in those cases, it's like killing the animal as a nevela. It's like cutting off its head without proper shechita, in which case it is mitameh beit habliya. So according to this Braita, the only case where killing an animal with malika, even if it's puzzle, is not going to make the animal okay, is if you do it inside the Beit HaMikdash and you do it for a karban, in which case the animal is not a nevela and it won't be mitameh beit habliya. So that's the first Braita. Tanya Idach, now we have another Braita which learns us out the same halacha from a slightly different source, and this is now, I would say, 20 lines from the bottom, the first word on the line. Tanya Idach, there's another Braita, and the Braita says the following: Yachol tehei shchitat chulin lifnim. You might have thought that if you do shchita, right, This again, we're referring to a bird here. So remember, the appropriate thing to do for a bird is malika. But if you, instead of doing malika with your finger, do shchita with a knife, and you do it of chulin, bifnim, sorry, so this is supposed to be shchita, but it's not supposed to be done in the Beit HaMikdash, right? So instead of doing it at home, where you're supposed to shecht your birds, you bring to the Beit HaMikdash and you do shchita inside the Beit HaMikdash. Or if it's kadshim, and that's what I meant before, sorry, if it's a carbon and it's supposed to be done with malika, but instead you do shchita, bein mi b'fnim, mein mi b'chutz, so whether you're inside the Beit HaMikdash or outside, how do you know that in all three of those cases, mitama Beit HaBli'ah, that the animal is considered a nevela, and if you eat it, it's mitame you and your clothing by touching your throat. Talmud nevela. Therefore, the Torah says it's a nevela, right? It says Gemara that a nevela makes you tameh, right? So therefore, an animal in this case, sorry, it's the opposite. These animals are not mitame. I take it back. These animals, you would have thought they're mitame Beit HaBli'ah, and therefore the pasuk says the only animal that's mitame Beit HaBli'ah is a nevela. Ask the Gemara the same question we asked before. Why is that proof that it's not tameh? Hanami nevelahi, right? If you kill an animal, it becomes a nevela. Ella, no, the limit is from the next word, Talmud lomar treifa, right? It's telling you the same is true. It has to be a nevela treifa. Ma treifa shaveh bifnim kabachutz. Just like a treifa is possible to eat, whether you're inside the Beit HaMikdash, you're outside the Beit HaMikdash, there's no heter for eating a treifa, right? So af kol shavot bifnim kibachut. So too, things that make something tameh are only things that apply both inside the Beit HaMikdash and outside the Beit HaMikdash, and that they're a problem. And therefore, since shchita is supposed to be done outside the Beit HaMikdash, right? When you do it inside the Beit HaMikdash, of course, you cannot eat that animal, but it's not mitameh Beit HaBli'ah. Yatza, and this says the Brighton now, Yatza, so it excludes shchitat chulin bifnim, if you shecht chulin animal inside the Beit HaMikdash, or if you shecht kadshim, bein bi bifnim, bein mi b'chutz, since ho'av lo shavu bifnim ki b'chutz, since by shchita, the psul of shechting it is not the same inside and outside. And we're going to ask in 1 second. By kadshim, it is the same inside and outside, meaning a carbon can never be shechted inside and outside. But we'll ask that in a second. But since in general, the psul of shechting an animal is only true inside the Beit HaMikdash, therefore, ein mitamim begadim Beit HaBli'ah. Therefore, it's not mitameh begadim Beit HaBli'ah if it was done. So ask the Gemara the question I just spoke out. Bishlam chulin. I understand this is a proof for chulin because remember, an animal that's chulin is supposed to be shechted by you or by the chicken place outside the Beit HaMikdash. That's normal. If you then come and shecht it inside the Beit HaMikdash, it's pasul, but it's not going to make you tameh as a nevela. So I get it. Lo shavu bifnim ki b'chutz, right? Because you can't say everywhere it's pasul to do shchita. Ella kadshim idi v'idi psulim. What do you mean by kadshim? It's not equal inside and outside. Whether you shecht the carbon bird with a knife inside the Beit HaMikdash, which is pasul, or outside the Beit HaMikdash, it's pasul. So why don't you say that shchita of a kadshim bird is not enough to take away the tumah Beit HaBli'ah? It would be a nevela. Says Rava, what the Braita meant to say, or what we would understand in the Braita, was that, think about it this way. Remember that the Torah says you're not allowed to shecht an animal outside the Beit HaMikdash, right? If you take a karban and you shecht it outside the Beit HaMikdash, you're chayv karet. That's called shchutei chutz. Right? Now, we're going to have a machloket later on, but there certainly is going to be an opinion that says that applies to birds also. Okay? So let's say you take a bird and it's a carbon, and you say, I'm not bringing it to the Beit HaMikdash. I'm going to do it at home in front of my own, say, private bama or in front of no bama, right? So then we're going to say later that even if you do shchita on that bird, you basically are chayev for shchutei chutz. So says Rava, im ho'ila lo shchitat chutz l'chayvo karet. If the shchita of that bird is enough to make you chayev karet, it means that the act of shchita was a very definitive act, because the person who did that act gets killed, or by karet at least. So since the act of shchita matters, lo to'il lo tara midei nevela, isn't that going to make it tahar midei nevela? So therefore, what you see from here is that since the act of shchutei chutz is a important and definitive act enough to be mechayev karet, it must be an important act on the animal, and it basically takes away the status of nevela from the animal, and that's why it's not tamei a Beit HaBli'ah. Says the Gemara, okay, that's a great explanation for an animal that you shechted outside the Beit HaMikdash. Ashkechan chutz. So, okay, I found a source for outside the Beit HaMikdash, but panim l'nalan. How do I know if I shecht an animal with a knife instead of my finger inside the Beit HaMikdash? How do I know that that is not mitamea Beit HaBli'ah? Answers the Gemara, because like we just said, because since you just proved that if we do the shechita outside, it's not tamei and has to be equal. If it's not equal, that means since it's not a problem outside, it can't be a problem on the inside. And so therefore, whether you do shechita of a korban that's a bird inside the Beit HaMikdash or outside, it's going to be a good shechita in the sense that it's no longer a nevela and it's not mitamei Beit HaBli'ah. Ask the Gemara, Ihachi, we are now 8 lines from the bottom. If that's true, malak kachim b'chutz namilo, why don't you say the same thing about malika of kachim outside? Remember, our Mishnah said that if you do malika of a carbon kachim outside, that's an avela, and it's mitamei Beit HaBli'ah. Why? Why don't you say that since if you did it on the inside, you did a carbon malika, that's normal, that's kosher. So that would not be mitamei. Why is it tamei outside? Lo shava bifnim ki b'chutz. So that seems to be a big problem, right? Amar Shimi Bar Ashi says Shimi Rashi, well, there's a reason for that. Because danin davar shelo behechshero min davar shelo behechshero. You can compare shchita of a carbon inside and outside because neither one is appropriate, right? You're not supposed to shecht an animal with a knife that's a carbon inside or outside. But you cannot compare malika inside and outside because malika inside the Beit HaMikdash is a very important act. It's the appropriate act for an animal. Malika outside the Beit HaMikdash is a completely inappropriate act. So ein danin davar shelo behechshero min davar shebehechshero. You cannot compare something that's done inappropriately, a malika outside, from a malika inside the Beit HaMikdash. Velo, really, you can. Tanya, we learned, and this was yesterday. We quoted this Braita yesterday, right? We learned yesterday. Minayin liyotzei shemalalo yired. How do you know that if something is a yotzei? Remember, yotzei is a carbon that went outside the Beit HaMikdash and then was brought back in. How do you know if that went outside and then you put on the it's puzzle? And if you put on the mizbeach that in Allah lo yired, that if it goes up to the mizbeach you don't take it down. So we said yesterday tisharei yotzei kasher bebama, because yotzei is kosher when you're outside the Beit HaMikdash. But how could you prove from outside where it's appropriate to have an animal without boundaries to inside where it's inappropriate? So how you see that you do compare them. Says the Gemara, well, you're right. As we said yesterday, hopefully if you learned yesterday's daf, we quoted this yesterday, that in fact that Braita does not really mean that. That Tana was azot Torah Tola riba samichle. He was relying on not a limud from outside to inside. It was actually based on a different pasuk of zot Torah Tola. But the only reason he was able to compare one to the other is because you have a pasuk of zot Torah Tola. But outside of the context of that pasuk, we generally would not compare them, and that is why malika that's done outside is not compared to malika that's done inside. Okay, very confusing Gemara. Nava looks confused, but I think we're going to hold it together. We have a new Mishnah, so you can get hopefully less confused. It's a complicated Mishnah too, though. Says the Mishnah now at the bottom of Samach Tet Amud Aleph, malak v'nimtzei treifa. The next application of this halacha, right? Remember the previous Mishnah was where you do malika with your left hand, or you do malika overnight, let's say. But this Mishnah is saying, let's say you do malika on a bird properly, but then you cut open the bird and it turns out that it's got a wound, right? And it's a treifa, and you can't bring that on the mizbeach. You have to throw it away, and you have to bring a new carbon. But is it tameh? So says the Mishnah, malak v'nimtzei treifa. Rabbi Meir Omer eno mitameh beit habliya. Says Rabbi Meir, it's not mitameh beit habliya, because even though you can't eat the animal, if you did eat it, you are not tameh because you did a malika that was a proper malika when you did it. Turn the page to Daf Samach Tet Amud Bet. Rabbi Yehuda says it is mitameh. Says Rabbi Yehuda, I disagree. Since the malika didn't do anything because the bird was a treifa, the malika did not take away the din of a nevela from this bird, and it's still tameh. Says the Mishnah at the top of Daf Samach Tet Amud Bet, the first line, Amar Rabbi Meir kal v'chomer. Says Rabbi Meir, it's a kal v'chomer. Everybody agrees, now you have to trust me on this, but it's true, that if you have an animal that's a nevela, right? A cow drops dead, right? It's tameh, what's called maga and masa. It's tameh if you lift it or if you touch it. If you shecht a cow, and then after you shecht the cow, you find out it's a treifa, we're going to see in the Gemara that everybody agrees that it's not tameh. Okay, you're not allowed to eat it because it's treifa, but it's not tameh like a nevela. Says Rabbi Meir, so I have a kal v'chomer from the cow to the bird. Im nevelat behema. You have a nevela of a behema, which, if it's a nevela, is very high level of tumah because it's mitama b'mago b'masa. It's tameh if you touch it or lift it. But shchitata mitarata mitrefata. If it's a trefa and you do shchita to it, it no longer is tameh. Sorry, shchitata mitaheret trefata mitumata. A lot of words there. Shchita purifies a trefa from tumah. So therefore, says Rabbi Meir, I have a kal v'chomer to nevelata of. Think about a bird that's a nevela. That's a very low level. If you touch a nevela bird, you're not tameh. If you lift it, you're not tameh. It's only if you eat it. She'eino mitama b'maga b'masa. It's not mitama if you touch it or lift it. It's only mitama if you eat it. So eino din shetei shchitata mitaharato mitrefato mitumato. Right? Mitahar trefato mitumato. So therefore, shchita of a bird should be mitaher a trefa from its tuma. And now, shchita is not what we're asking about. What did our Mishnah ask about? Malika, right? Says Rabbi Meir, I take the kal v'chomer one more step. Ma matzino b'shchitato shimachsharta la'achila. Just like shchita of a regular bird allows you to eat it, u'mitaheret trefato, mitumato, and it takes the trefa status off and makes it takes out the tuma. So to af malikato. So now when you start talking about a carbon, right? Malika of the carbon, shehi machsharto la'achila. It allows you to eat a carbon. Titaher trefato midei tumato. So therefore, it would be mitaher the trefa from tuma, and therefore says Rabbi Meir, I have a kal v'chomer from an animal, and of course I'm extending the kal v'chomer, which most of you are probably up in arms because this is a limitation of what's called dayo, right? If you learn from a kal v'chomer, you have dayo levo min adin liot kinidon. You can only learn from the thing you're learning from, and the thing you learned from was an animal that you shechted. You're learning that to a bird that you shecht, and then extending it to a bird that you did malika, which seems like a violation of dayo. Well, the Gemara will ask that, but that is Rabbi Meir's kal v'chomer. Rabbi Yossi says, I don't agree, because daya, right? Daya kinivlat behima. I agree with you that you could compare a bird to an animal, but just like an animal, shchitato mitarato. Only shchita of an animal makes it tahar from nevela, not malikato, v'lo malikato, not malika. Says the Gemara right away. That's a great answer Rabbi Yossi had. Rabbi Meir lo darsh dayo. I don't care. Rabbi Meir doesn't hold of dayo. Va dayo doraito. Dayo is this concept of dayo levo min adin, meaning if you learn something from a kal v'chomer, you can't be stricter than the kal v'chomer. The thing you learned from is from the Torah. How do we know that? Titania, it's a very famous Braita. Says the Braita quotes midin kal v'chomer ketzad. How do you do a kal v'chomer? This is a instruction guide. This Braita. How do you determine what's a kal v'chomer? Meaning what's the source that there's such a thing as a kal v'chomer? Says the Braita. It's based on the incident, the end of Parshat Balotcha, of the tzarat of Miriam. Right? Miriam spoke ill about Moshe, and she got tzarat, and she had to go outside of the camp. And Moshe went and davened to Hashem and said, "Heal her." Right? El narafan Allah. And then the pasuk continues and says, "Vayomer Hashem al Moshe." Hashem said to Moshe, "Well, v'avia," I'm reading the pasuk now. V'avia yarok yirak b'fia. If her father had spit into her face, "Halo tikalem shivat yamim," she would be embarrassed for at least 7 days. So tisager shivat yamim l'chutz nachaneh. I'm reading the end of the pasuk, right? Let us put her aside. Let her separate herself for 7 days. Says the Braita, why would it be 7 days? You should have said kal v'chomer l'shchina arba asar yom. If for a human father you're embarrassed 7 days, then for God it should be 14 days. Tosfos here brings very cutely the Gemara Nida that when you think about how a person's created, it's the mother, the father, and God. So God is equal to the mother and the father. So he should be double the time of the father. That's where he got 14 from, right? Either way, it should be longer for Hashem. Why isn't it longer for Hashem? It must be because it's a kal v'chomer, right? God is saying to Moshe, kal v'chomer. If her father had spit in her face, she would be embarrassed for 7 days. So with God, it should be at least 7 days, but not more. If you're learning it out from the father in this case, you can't be more than that. So you see, everyone has to agree with Dayo. Rabbi Meir can't disagree with the pasuk. Says you're right. Rabbi Meir made it sound in the Mishnah like a kal v'chomer, but in fact, it's based on a pasuk, not a kal v'chomer. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Avin, Rabbi Meir kra ashkach v'darish. Rabbi Meir had a pasuk that he found, and he darshan that to tell him. Remember, the halacha of Rabbi Meir is that just like with an animal, if you shecht an animal and it turns out to be a treifa, it's no longer tameh like a nevela. You're not allowed to eat it because it's a treifa, but it's not tameh like a nevela. Said Rabbi Meir, I'm for sure that's true by a bird because the tumah of nevela of a bird is even less. that if you shech the bird and it turns out to be a treifa, it's not tameh. Said Rabbi Meir, and I will extend that to Malika. Said Rabbi Yossi, you can't extend it to Malika. It's only true about shechita of a bird, not by Malika of a bird. But Rabbi Meir had a pasuk. What was Rabbi Meir's pasuk? It says the following: Zot, where am I? Zot Torata Behima, right? Around 15 lines down. It says in the pasuk, I'm going to read the whole pasuk to you, and this is in Vayikra, Yud Aleph, Zot Torata Behima v'ha'of. This is the rules of the behima and the oaf, and furthermore, everything that's on the land is talking about tum'ah. Says the Braita, what connection is there between birds and animals? Chi be'ezet Torah shafta behima la'of, of la behima. In what way is the tumah of a bird similar to the tumah of an animal and vice versa? Behima mitama b'mago masa. An animal that's in nevela is tameh by touching it. Of eino mitama b'mago masa, but a bird is not tameh by touching it. Of mitama b'gadim ha'beit habliya. A bird is tameh if you eat it. Behima eino mitama b'gadim ha'beit habliya. But an animal that's a nevela doesn't make you tameh if you eat it. Only makes you tameh if you touch it. And if someone puts it in your mouth, you're not tameh. So why does the Torah say behima ve'of? Elalomar, it's to teach you ma behima, just like a behima, davar shemachshiro lachila, the thing that makes it allowed to be eaten, meaning shchita. If you do shchita mitaher trefata mitumata, it takes away the tuma from an animal, even if it's a trefa, because it's no longer called a nevela. Af of davar shemachshiro ba'achila mitaher trefato mitumato. So too by a bird, a thing that takes away that allows you to eat it, which by a carbon is malika, will take away the status of trefa. So it's not from the Kal V'chomer alone. The Kal V'chomer is enough for shchita, but this extra pasuk is there to tell you an additional halacha beyond shchita, to tell you that anything that makes the animal kosher to eat in general will take away its status of nevela. So if you do malika on a bird and it turns out to be a treifa, of course you can't eat it because it's a treifa, but it's no longer a nevela and it's not mitameh beit habliya. And so if you by mistake eat it, you won't become tameh. You'd be over for treifa, but you're not tameh. So that's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Ask the Gemara, we'll do this last piece today, Rabbi Yehuda my time. Now Rabbi Yehuda seems to disagree with the whole thing. Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishnah that if you do malika on a bird and it's a treifa, that it is not kosher from the vela, meaning it's tameh from the vela. What's his reason? Because kra ashkach v'daresh. He also has a pasuk that he darshan, and the pasuk that he darshan is one that we quoted before, where it says nivela utrefa, right? Where am I? Nivela utrefa. I'm going to read the pasuk again because now I have this gemara that has it. It's chas l'chol nefesh asher tochal nivela utrefa. Then he's tameh ad harif, right? By a bird that's dead, a nevelat of tahar. So said the Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, treifa lama nemra. Why does the Torah say if the bird is a nevela or treifa makes you tameh? I don't understand. In treifa chaya, right? If an animal can be a treifa and it lives, then this animal lived as a treifa and eventually it died. And when it died, it became a nevela. Harei nevela amura. So if it died, it's a nevela. In treifa eno chaya, if the treifa doesn't live, meaning it's going to die right away, harehi b'chla nevela, then it's also nevela, it's dying. Ella, why does the Torah say treifa, nevela treifa? It's telling you that even if you do ella lahavi treifa sheshachta shemitama, that even if you do shchita on a bird and you take away its status of nevela, essentially, it's still a treifa. And since it's still a treifa, it doesn't lose its status of a nevela, essentially, and it remains in its status, and therefore it is mitameh a beit habliya. That's Rabbi Yehuda's proof. Says Rav Shizbi, I got a question. Now, if you have to run, you get 5 minutes. Take 5 minutes. Let's do it. Says Rav Shizbi, I got a question for you. Where's Rav Shizbi? We're 20 lines from the bottom. Elamiata, I got another pasuk where it says nevela and treifa, and what you're saying cannot be correct. Because it says in the pasuk, this is a pasuk in Tzav, right? Vayikra Tzav. The chelev nevela, the chelev treifa. The fat from a nevela, the fat from a treifa, the pasuk says, I'm reading now, ye'aseh l'chol melacha, you can do anything you want with it. It's not mitameh. Although a nevela is tameh, the fat of a nevela is not tameh. However, ends the pasuk, v'achol lo tochlenu. You can't eat it because you never eat chelev anyways. You can't eat chelev of a nevela or a treifa. Now, why does it say chelev nevela v'chelev treifa? According to you, Rabbi Yehuda. Hatam nami. Nema, why don't you say the exact same words you said earlier? And now we're quoting Rabbi Yehuda. Im treifa chaya, if a treifa is going to live for a long time and then eventually die, harei nevela amura. I already said nevela. Im treifa ena chaya, if a treifa doesn't live for a long time and it dies right away, harei b'chla nevela, and then it's a nevela. Ella, so why does the Torah say that you can use the fat of a nevela and a treifa. It's to tell you, according to your logic, Rabbi Yehuda, lahavi treifa sheshachta, to tell you that if you shech the treifa, shechal bambu tahor, that you're allowed to use the fat of that treifa. What's the chiddush? Michlal dehit mitama, implying that the meat of the treifa is tameh. So you take an animal, you shech the animal, it turns out to be a treifa. That says the pasuk now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that animal remains tameh. But that's not true. And I told you in the Mishnah it wasn't true. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Some said it's a braita. The pasuk says yamut min ha-behema. If an animal dies, it becomes tameh, but it says min ha-behema to tell you not all animals that die become tameh. Mikzat behema mitama, mikzat behema ina mitama. Some animals that die become tameh. Some that die don't become tameh. Ve'ezeh zozu treifa sheshachta. The ones that don't become tameh are an animal that died. You can't eat it because it's a treifa, but you did a proper shechita, right? So what you see from the pasuk is that an animal that has chelev that dies that had shechita, the chelev is mutar. The animal must be mutar also. Ella, what is the reason that the Torah says treifa mibayle? You must take to tell you lemute tme'ah. It's telling you that you can use the chelev of a nevela and a treifa, but only an animal that's a kosher animal, not a tme'ah, not a pig, let's say. Misha yesh b'minot treifa. It's only referring to animals that sometimes you eat them and sometimes you don't eat them because they're a treifa. Yatzazu she'en b'minot treifa. A pig is not a treifa. A pig is tameh, right? You never eat a pig anyway. So therefore, the fat of a pig is inappropriate to use no matter what. But then if that's what the pasuk is telling you, say the same thing by a bird. Hachanami lemute of tameh she'en b'minot treifa. Say the same thing, that the reason the pasuk says nevela treifa by a bird is not to tell me, like Rabbi Yehuda said earlier, that if you shecht a bird that's a treifa, it's still tameh. It's to tell you that if you shecht a bird that's an of tameh, right, an eagle, that you are still tameh. You're not tameh, sorry, right? You're only tameh if you shecht a bird that is a bimino treifa. That it could be a treifa, meaning it's a kosher animal. But a bird that's an eagle would not become tameh if you shechted it. But that's a very side halacha, just to be clear, because the bottom point is, and we're going to stop here, so now we can run, is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, what is the reason to say that if you shecht a bird, it does not, and it's a treifa, then it still is tameh like a nevela, right? So Rabbi Yehuda said it was because the pasuk said nevela treifa. And then we just asked on him, but it says the same words nevela treifa by chelev, by the fat of an animal. And there it can't mean what you're saying it means. So how do you know? It must mean something else. It must mean to exclude a non-kosher animal. So to nevela and treifa by a bird must be to include a non-kosher bird. And so you're stuck in the beginning, which we're going to stop at, but pick it up tomorrow morning, of how does Rabbi Yehuda know that if you take a bird that is a kosher bird and you shecht it, and you discover after you shecht it, or even before, that it's a treifa, that it is still tameh abei tabli'ah. So we're going to leave that question open, and God willing, pick it up from those words, which is 6
I
lines.
have no idea where he is right now.
I'm
Wow.
6 lines from the bottom of Daf Samach Tet Amud Bet. But we're going to stop here, and I'll see you all tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m., I hope. Shavua Tov. It's complicated Gemara. Okay.
This is just too much. I have no idea where he was. Just unbelievable. There's just no way you can keep track of this guy.